Last time on Fixity Fix, we took care of the front brakes on our 5th generation 4Runner Limited. This time on Fixity Fix, I'm going to walk you through my steps for addressing the rear brakes on a 5th generation 4Runner. I'm David, and you're watching Fixity Fix. Fixity Fix! The first step is to jack up the rear end of the car. Make sure if you're just jacking up the rear end that you use chocks under both front wheels and that you always use jack stands to safely have your car in the air. Make sure you're using the manufacturer's recommended lift points as well. On the 5th generation 4Runner, the lift point with one jack is the rear differential pumpkin, and I put the jack stands under the frame. When I'm using jack stands, I'll typically tuck the wheels underneath the car as an extra safety measure. For the rear brakes, as with the front brakes, you're going to want to work on these in pairs. In other words, if you replace pads or rotors on one side of the car, you also want to do the other side of the car, so do both axles on the rear. You may or may not need to do the front brakes. In this case, I did both, so you can check the other videos for the process on how I took care of the front brake. Come around behind the caliper. This is where the rear caliper mounts to the axle. This is a 17mm bolt here and a 17mm bolt here that hold caliper retaining clip, this guy right here, the bottom of it and the top, to the caliper itself. The caliper in turn is bolted into the caliper retainer by these two bolts right here that are also the slide pins that allows the caliper to slide and for the pads to squeeze the rear rotor. You might have noticed I have a red mark here on the bottom inside edge of the caliper. I put that red mark there just to eliminate any confusion while I'm figuring out where to put the squealer piece when I'm setting up the new pad shims, these stainless steel shims that are going to be replaced when we replace the pads. The squealer is what makes the brakes squeal when the brakes are starting to run out, when the pads are losing their meat. The squealer contacts the disc and makes a noise that lets you know it's time to service your brakes. Those need to go on the biting edge of the disc. As the disc turns around this way, you'll want the squealer shim on this side. Toyota tends to have them on the inboard part, and I just want to make sure we keep oriented to where everything is with this caliper as we go. I'm beginning by breaking the torque on these four 17mm bolts. So I'm using a breaker bar because these are torqued down pretty tight. We break it, and then I am taking I'm loosening the slide pins first, and those bolts will come out first. Just going to get them loose. I'm now also going to use the breaker bar to just start to loosen the caliper retainer bolts, which are in there much more tightly, 75 foot-pounds. That one almost knocked me off my stool. I've got this long bread tie at the ready to support the caliper so I don't damage the rubber brake hose. First, we're going to take the caliper off. And you remove these caliper slide pins to do that. It's a good idea to mark which one goes on top, because you want to keep these in the same holes they came out of if you're reusing them. It's not utterly important, but it's just a best practice. Caliper is going to slide off. Put an old brake pad back in its slot, and we're going to use a pair of channel locks to squeeze this piston back in place. They do make a special tool for this, but I find it's really not worth the money or the effort when you can get it with what you've probably already got in your shop already. You want to use a old brake pad or some kind of shim just to keep from damaging your piston. You want to go slowly so that you don't damage anything in your brake system with this back pressure. A lot of people will loosen the bleeder valve to just let the pressure out from the bleeder valve. That's fine. It's a lot easier to do. If you do that, it's just a little bit of a mess. All the way. There you go. Just attach it reasonably securely so that we're not damaging our rubber brake hose. Then we can remove the retainer bolts. And keep up with everything. Alright, this is just going to slide right off. So here is the caliper retainer. It also retains the brake pads, the brake pad shims. These are an important part of keeping the pads from squealing when you're braking or making rattling noises. These are the shims that the pads slide against in the caliper. For what it's worth, this is more typical of most brake systems where you have the slide pins that fit into these rubber grommets, and the caliper slides along here and thus squeezes the pads when activated. It's a good idea to at least clean out and put new silicone brake grease. Do not use anti-seize. Do not use anything other than silicone brake grease specifically for this purpose, for lubricating these slide pins. Since the kit that I got has rotors, pads, shims, slide retainer clips, and this is that little squealer that I was talking about here where it's marked that indicates with a squeal when the brake pads are too thin, which mine are, and it's squealing. This is where this goes, and that's why this is marked. These are in great shape, but my new kit came with new rubber grommets, so I'm just going to use the new ones. These are readily available at parts stores if your pad kit doesn't come with them. For what it's worth, I'm using Power Stop rotors and pads in the heavy-duty towing kit they offer. No one is sponsoring Fixity Fix. This is just what I happen to be using. I've had good luck with Power Stop kits on an Acura CL sports car. I used to have, some might debate whether that's a sports car, but hey, I'm an old guy. And a couple of trucks. It does pretty well. The new rotors I have are drilled and slotted, giving me a little more cooling and performance in my opinion. Opinions vary on that. There are people that say don't use them on 4x4s or things that see heavy mud use because sometimes the drills and the holes in the slots can fill up with mud, etc. But I'm pretty fastidious about keeping the moving parts clean, in the words of David Lee Roth, another old guy. Here's an important tip when you're taking care of Toyota brakes. You're going to see that we've got a couple of places where we can see through the hat of the rotor, and we want to orient these to 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock, and somewhere around the 6 o'clock position we're going to have an adjustment wheel that we can turn up or down to tighten or loosen the emergency brake pads, which ride here inside and function like old school drum brakes. They get pushed out when you put on your emergency brake and seize against the rotor. You are going to want to have your emergency brake off when you're doing this, otherwise you won't be able to spin the wheel. You take a look here in this bottom hole with a light, and you move this until you can see the adjustment wheel. I'm not going to be able to show you the adjustment wheel with the camera the way this is situated. I just can't get enough light into this hole. I will show you more when we do get the rotor off. I can see that I've gotten to it, so I can just loosen it up by moving it down with the screwdriver a few clicks, and that'll allow me to pull this rotor off if I can't just pull it off easily by hand. Alright, so this is coming off just fine. If it would not come off just fine, your first step would be to just thread in some M8 bolts with a 1.25 pitch evenly into each of these holes and just tighten them, and that will drive the disc off of the hub. There are little blue retaining springs that hold in each of these brake pads, this pad and this pad, and those blue retaining springs need to be in place and secure. It's important to check those before you carry on with the brake job to make sure that the e-brake is working. The e-brake on this was not working well, and I discovered that one of those blue springs had been knocked loose and was just riding along in the bottom of the inside of this drum, so I had to repair that on the other side. Let's get the light just right here. Here is the hole that you would go through, and again, you can get through this hole by spinning the wheel. If you can't get your disc off, so just pretend the disc is right here and that hole is lined up around the 6 o'clock position. You can see the threaded wheel now that you're going to push, and you're going to have to experiment whether down or up works, but you use the screwdriver to move it so that it opens up these pads. You'll also tighten it so to where you can just barely get the rotor on and then spin it with no drag just to get your parking brake set as you put the new rotor on it. We want to clean off with brake clean and a wire brush where the disc mounts to the hub. Make sure you're working in a well-ventilated area if you're using brake clean. A clean surface is going to ensure that your brake rotor / drum mounts flatly and evenly to your hub. If it doesn't mount flatly and evenly, you're going to get some unwanted vibrations that are going to massively increase the wear and tear on your car and impact your drivability. Shake up your soft drinks. I blast it again with brake clean to float off all that rust and corrosion. It's a best practice to coat this whole surface with anti-seize. You do not want to use grease or oil. This prevents what's called galling, which is rust's way of welding two parts together. Applications like this, you want to avoid getting anti-seize or any oils on your lug bolts or lug nuts. A little bit's not going to hurt you. So if you get any on there, just wipe it off with a rag or with a little bit of brake clean. You can change your gloves or clean up your hands before you mess with your new rotor. You don't want to get any type of lubrication, even skin oils, on your new rotor or your new pad surfaces that meet the rotor. That'll impair your braking performance. I don't think it makes a difference between your sides of which rotors are there, but these power stops come labeled rear passenger side, rear driver's side. Take these stickers off, because these stickers will create a misalignment in how your wheel attaches when you finally put your wheel on. Blast the new rotor with some brake clean on any of the surfaces that pads are going to ride. So hit it with brake clean, wipe it down with a rag, preferably while it's still wet with brake clean. Trying to do this where you can see it. Get both sides. Get the center here where your parking brake hits. Ooh, now I've got a clean knee. Now that any assembly oils or waxes or whatever they put on this thing are off, we line this up. All right, that slides on It actually slides on a little too easily, so we're going to tighten this adjustment bolt down here to make sure our e-brake's going to work okay. I usually move it where it's impossible to put the rotor on and then back off from there. Okay, that's too tight. So we want to move it down a few notches. See if we can slide it on. Make sure we can turn our wheel without drag. Okay, that's perfect. I'm going to turn it up a few notches just to tighten the e-brake a little bit. All right, that's very good. I don't feel drag, but I know if I tightened it more, there would be drag. I'm gonna clean off my caliper with some brake clean. I'm not gonna hit the rubber boot with this wire brush, but I am gonna clean the surface of the caliper piston. And then the back part that pushes against the other pad. This is the piston, and this surface is going to push against one pad. This end of the caliper, these fingers are going to push against the back of the other pad, and it'll squeeze the pads against the rotors. We're going to go ahead and add some brake system grease to this piston surface. You don't want to use anything other than grease that's specifically for brake parts, because anything else is going to ruin your rubber seals, which are all over brake systems and calipers. You want to get the faces of these fingers. This is going to keep your new brakes from squealing or making noise. The only time they should squeal is when the pad surfaces get so worn that the rotor surface is hitting the squeal indicators. These come pre-crosshatched. You can see this crosshatch pattern here. If you are reusing your rotors or had yours resurfaced and they don't have a crosshatch pattern, you need to hit them with a random orbit sander with about 120 grit on it before you get to this assembly phase. Really, any new rotors or resurfacing places will typically do this for you, but just make sure when you're doing a brake job here, you get the rotor off and you get this type of surface on it, and it's nice and even. All right, fixers, our next step is to take the old pads out of the caliper retainer, remove the rubber parts, clean everything up, hit it with a wire brush on parts where metal goes in or parts where the caliper slide pins go in. We'll clean off the slide pins themselves too. Earlier you saw me pop out this grommet. It just pulls right out. And I'm throwing away the old ones because I've got new ones right here. This other side can pry out. Usually with a fingernail or screwdriver. You want to be very careful not to damage the metal with anything. So I try to do this by pulling on the rubber rather than using anything metal. And that pops right out of the top. And you don't have to worry because this will only fit in one of the holes and in one direction. The little rubber cap here shows you the outside, so you know the larger grommets go in to the larger holes on this side. I have marked this caliper for where the squealer pad goes, so I know this is inside bottom where this red is. And when I'm cleaning with brake clean, I want to make sure I don't knock all that paint off. So I can go ahead and disassemble the old pads from this unit, and they just slide right out. Just like that. Put silicone grease, the same brake grease we were using, on the surfaces that slide against anything. So I'm going to go ahead and put some under this area where the squealer goes, and it can only go on one way, just like that. I'm just putting it on before I forget where it goes. Got a little bit of silicone grease on the other side of it where it's going to ride. We'll put this away for later. And we can toss the old pad. Pad comes out of the other side, just pull it right out. And toss it. The next thing that comes off are these stainless steel retainer clips, shims. And you can chuck those in the trash too. And then we blast this off with brake clean, living up to its name. You want to blow it through caliper slide holes on both sides just to get it nice and clean in there. You want to wire brush where those shims mount in. Just to have a really clean mounting and sliding surface for those shims. Blast everything again with brake clean. Give your brake clean time to flash off. We're going to lube up the mating surfaces of our shims. Any part of the shim that's going to have contact with the caliper edges or caliper retainer gets a little coating of this special brake grease. You don't want to use anti-seize. These are in different orientations, and the little ears on the end here go to the outside of the caliper on each respective side, and you clip in the smaller clip to the inside first, and then you push in the outside and it clips right into place. You don't want to use, I see on YouTube many times people pushing these things in with a screwdriver. What you should do is you should pull on the ear with your needle nose pliers so that you don't bend up the sliding surface, which is where your pad's going to slide. I'll show you more of that in a minute. So clip it from the inside first, give it a push. Sometimes you can push it in with your fingers, and if you can't, use the needle nose pliers to pull on this ear for the inside. Get that slid in. And there we have it. Same on the back side. Fastidiousness is going to pay off here. It takes you a little longer to get them in this way, but you're not going to risk bending anything the wrong way, and your pads will slide easily and won't give you uneven wear as time goes by, which is what happens to people that do this with a screwdriver or a drift or a chisel. The pad slides in like this, and you can see how it's going to fit with a little bit of pressure. And here's the squealer bar just to show you how that orients and goes in. So I apply grease to any part of the metal tabs on the pads that are going to be in contact with our slide points, and that's a much more targeted way to keep sand and dirt out of your braking system. It's better to put it here on the sides of the metal parts of the pad than on the inside of the retaining clips, because it keeps the grease only where you need it. So we're lining up the brake pad. I'm being very careful not to touch the part of the brake pad that contacts the brake rotor as I push these in. And you want to just get these barely seated so that you have room for the rotor to fit when it's time to put these caliper clips back on the vehicle. Only one way these things fit in. There we go. If your pads don't come with these shims, reuse the ones from your original pads or get some new ones. These happen to come with stainless steel shims. A lot of people will tell you to put a coating of brake grease on these shims. I don't do that because it results in too much grease. I put the grease on the end of the piston and then on the fingers on the caliper itself that contact this piece, and that keeps the grease only where you need it, minimizing the chance of contaminating the business end of your brake pads. We've marked the top caliper slide pin. We don't want any contamination on these slide pins since the whole braking operation relies on them. Holding the thread side down and away from the new caliper pads, we're just going to take off any anti-seize that's left over on the threads so we can apply new anti-seize effectively. Blast it again. We're going to put in our new rubber pieces. We're going to lubricate the slide pins, not the rubber pieces. I'm using a freshly cleaned drift that will push this rubber grommet all the way through, being careful not to overdo it, and to keep even pressure, and to make sure the barbed end attaches on the other end of the hole. So that's in well. This part, make sure it's good and clean. This has got a weep hole in it that's going to let extra grease out to keep your brakes from binding up, from being over greased. A lot of manufacturers don't do that. Make sure this is all clean. And then for this part of the grommet, I'm going to put a little bit of this silicone grease in here just to keep the rubber conditioned just a tiny bit on the mounting flange, just to make sure we get a good seal. The flanged end goes into the caliper, and then this end points out. And you can see that it'll mate in there if you push it in just right. And just make sure that the flange is seated by pulling gently. It doesn't take much to pull it out, and that flange will seat just like that. We're ready to take all this back over to the car. Time to get some anti-seize on our cleaned threads for the caliper bracket mounting bolts and the caliper slide pins. Making sure we're keeping up with the orientation of which slide pin came out of the top or the bottom. If you get it mixed up, it's probably not worth getting new ones. It'll probably work just fine. It's just best practice to keep them in the same holes. And we know this is the top slide pin because we marked it with paint. We know that this is where we put the squealer, and of course it goes on the biting edge of the rotor on the inside. So this slides in, lines up just the way it came out. We're going to put the caliper retainer mounting bolts in first, and this takes a bit of fettling to get them started. You don't want to cross thread these. It's a high grade metal, so it's pretty hard to cross thread anyway. Just get it finger tight on the top. In fact, less than finger tight, because you want to be able to wiggle that to get the other one started just right. sure this is nice and centered, and here's where you can finger tighten those bolts. We're going to torque them to 76 foot-pounds. Reset our torque wrench to 35 foot-pounds. Where we take our caliper back down and make sure this piston surface, this circumference, has got brake grease on it, and the inside edges of these fingers. Make sure that your brake hose is not twisted, and then you just slide your caliper over your brake pads, and you might have to push your brake pads in as far as they'll go to make everything fit. Like magic, it fits perfectly. You're going to want to make sure that you have a clean instrument here and get these rubber grommets lined up with your caliper so your caliper slide pins can find a home. Sometimes it's good to gently insert a screwdriver into the barrel and just move them into place, and those are seated properly. Here's the part where he goes on and on and on about brake grease and not anti-seize or oil or anything else for the various reasons I've already bored you with. The top slide pin, we know it's the top pin because we marked it when we took it out. You want to put a moderate helping of this grease on here and rub it on the smooth surface of the caliper slide pin. Cover everything with this grease. I've found some of these taken out before where the grease just didn't cover parts of it. It won't really move around a lot. Get a little bit on the tip, and then make sure you get over this flange that's going to seal to the rubber. Do not get the grease on the threads. We've already got Loctite, blue Loctite on those threads. This top one's going to slide right in. I explained why it's important not to over grease these. Get it finger tight. Make sure you haven't cross-threaded it. Make sure you're not getting any gunk or dirt or dog hairs or whatever on this. If you do, you gotta clean it off and start over. And then wiggle it to get it in, and then get the thread started by hand, and you're probably going to have to move your caliper around to make sure it centers. Give it a tug to make sure it's seated, and then we're going to go to 65 foot-pounds on each of these slide pins. I'm going to torque it. I'm going to sneak up on the torque here on each side just so I keep things centered and it'll slide better theoretically. That's it for the bottom, and that's it for the top. As the caliper slides, everything's gonna get in place here as we put pressure on the piston. All right, all this is torqued and good to go. Our bleeder port is on the top, so we know this is oriented correctly. We don't have any twist or undue stress on our brake hose. The ABS is looking good and attached. We're going to remove anything from the wheel well here. We're going to make sure the rotor turns without any undue drag. There will be a little bit of drag, and that'll go away as the hydraulic system reestablishes itself. If you did open your brake bleed nipples, for example, to get your pistons set back to the fully compressed position, then you're going to need to bleed your brakes before you test drive the car. Some people put anti-seize on the top of the hat of the rotor. I'll probably do that before I put the wheels back on. You want to do a test drive after you get your wheels back on. After I've thoroughly checked my work, now's the time to do a test drive. And I first start off with just backing up and moving forward a few times to make sure everything's working properly. If it's not, then it's time to get the car back up in the air, pull off the wheels, have a look and see what got missed and correct it. Then it's time to follow any recommendations from the brake pad and or rotor manufacturer for braking in the brakes. On the power stops, they want you to assertively brake from 40 miles per hour to 5 miles per hour about 5 times, and then from 30 miles per hour to 10 miles per hour about 5 more times, then drive around and let the brakes cool for a little while, and then you're good to go. That's going to be different for different manufacturers, so your mileage may vary. Thanks for watching, and next time we're going to do a brake bleed and brake flush video. And then very soon I'm going to be addressing worn out shock absorbers on the 5th generation 4Runner Limited. That's going to involve an X-Reass or cross relative absorber system delete with replacement by Bilstein 4600 shocks. So you'll want to tune in for that one. Thanks for watching, and if you found this helpful, please give it a like, and maybe even consider subscribing to the channel. And if you hit the bell button when you subscribe, you'll get notified when a new Fixity Fix video drops.